Psalm 32 is all about the burden of trying to hide our sins from God, and then the blessing of finally confessing that sin and being forgiven. We can't prove it, but most people think that this psalm was written after David's sin with Bathsheba and Uriah. Remember, David did not confess that sin until he was confronted by the prophet Nathan in 2 Samuel 12. And so there must have been some interim period, we don't know how long, when David was sort of keeping this sin a secret in his mind and not even talking about it with the Lord. It wasn't until God sent Nathan to tell that story about the rich man who stole the young ewe lamb from a poor man that David says, that's outrageous. How could anyone do that? And then Nathan confronts him and says, you are the man in this story. You are the rich man who has everything that he could ever want, and yet he takes the one wife of the poor man. And then David says, I have sinned against the Lord. And perhaps Psalm 32 is looking back on that time and showing us how refusing to confess that sin on his own and keeping the guilt bottled up inside was absolutely destroying him. In verse 3, when I was silent about my sin, my body wasted away through my groaning all day long. His guilt was just eating him up inside, and he had no strength, because when you're guilty, you just feel like you're always on the run and you're always looking over your shoulder, and you're kind of having to live a double life and put on a good happy face like everything is fine when you know it's just ripping you apart inside because you're not right with God. And interestingly, there's a connection with Psalm 31, because there David entrusted his life to the hands of God. He said, into your hand I commit my spirit, and my times are in your hand. Well, here in verse 4, he says, day and night your hand was heavy upon me. So sometimes trusting our lives to the hand of God means expecting discipline from his hand. And here we see one of the ways he disciplines us is through healthy guilt and shame that are designed by God to haunt us and to keep us from sleeping at night, because we know things are not right with our Creator, and God is using that heavy hand. It's almost like pressure. God is pushing down with his hand, squeezing David with this guilt so that David will stop running from God and stop trying to hide from God, who already sees all of it. In fact, the very last line in 2 Samuel 11, after David's sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, it says, but the thing that David had done was evil in the sight of the Lord. So this is not hidden from God at all, and yet David is trying to hide it, and he's stuffing all of this inside as if it never happened. But once David finally admits his sin, acknowledges it, and confesses it, oh my, he feels so blessed. He says, verse 1, how blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. How blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. Now David has no more deceit in his heart. He's not hiding. He's not pretending to be someone he's not. He's just totally been real with God and just poured out his heart and said, here's my sin. And now, as a result of David uncovering his sin, God in his mercy covers that sin back over. And as a result, it's like this huge weight has been lifted off of his heart. And so David turns to his audience in verses 6 and 7 and warns them, if you're a godly person, make sure to go to God in prayer immediately and confess your sin. Don't try to hide it from him. Instead, make God your hiding place. Hide in him, not from him. And then God himself speaks through David as a prophet in verses 8 through 11, and also speaks to the audience and says, follow my instruction. Don't be stubborn like a mule, and don't just wait to obey me until after you've been disciplined. Obey me immediately, and you won't have to go through that. You won't need a bit or a bridle in your mouth to cause pain to turn you back to the right way. Just follow the right way in the first place, and you'll have joy and not sorrow. But the beautiful thing about this psalm is that even though David experienced the sorrow of delayed obedience, there was still hope for him, and he stopped being stubborn, turned to the Lord, and found the blessedness of forgiveness. And so that's our practice, immediate confession after sin. I understand the temptation to hide from God. In fact, in the garden, when Adam first sinned, that's what he did. He hid from God in shame. Sometimes we're so ashamed of what we've done, we're afraid to face God. Other times, we're just in denial about how horrible our sin actually was. And so we just go on about our day thinking, if I just ignore it, maybe it'll go away. And God will just give me a pass on this one and I can go about my business. And that's not how it works, because God takes sin seriously, and so should we. And we may end up feeling that heavy pressure of God's hand, and we're just filled with guilt. And that's when we immediately need to respond to that guilt and say, Father, I have sinned against you. Please have mercy on me. 1 John 1 and verse 9 says, if we confess our sins, he is faithful and righteous to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And of course, the joy and the blessedness of forgiveness is only possible because of what Jesus did for us on the cross. It's why John continues in 1 John 2:1 to say, if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. He is our defense attorney in heaven who will argue our case, not based on our own goodness, but on his goodness and what he accomplished for us on the cross. It's why in Romans chapter 4, when Paul is explaining the gospel and how we can never be made righteous by our own works, but only by God's grace, he actually quotes from Psalm 32, verses 1 and 2. Praise be to God for crediting righteousness to our account, because we didn't have any righteousness in our account, and Jesus put it in our account by his blood. And so our prayer today is, Father, help me not be stubborn like a mule. Help me not to obey you just because I got disciplined. Help me confess my sin immediately to you so that I can experience the blessedness of the one whose transgressions are forgiven.